Just to start off with giving a bit of background. So this is actually based on some work that we've done over many years with a dozen or so colleagues, and which is in a recent volume published just under a year ago. So as you know, we are experiencing a new global environment, I would like to call it, of higher economic, geopolitical, and trade uncertainties. And although it's, sitting here and we think, oh, these levels of uncertainty and health shock on top of that it's been huge. Actually, these uncertainties are not new for all economies. Some economies have been experiencing huge levels of uncertainty for many decades. And I'm thinking in particular about major oil exporters, in particular those in the Middle East and North Africa region, who've been exposed to these uncertainties for, I would say, over the last 4 decades. And mainly this uncertainty has come through the commodity channel, but also through other channels that I will explain. So hopefully in this short presentation, I'm going to focus on resource-rich economies, and I'm going to draw from various chapters from this recent volume, which I've edited with Jeff Nugent at the University of Southern California and Hoda Salim at the International Monetary Fund. And I'm hoping to discuss how uncertainty is not just a major problem, but actually has led to extremely disappointing economic outcomes and disappointing outcomes overall in terms of long-run growth and stability, and with a particular devastating effects for the private sector, which is sort of supposedly the engine of growth for these Middle East and North Africa economies in the future. I also want to illustrate really what the role of institutions, and in particular macroeconomic policy, is in offsetting these negative effects due to what I like to call the volatility curse. So this curse in these economies have been mainly, as I said, transmitted through the commodity channel. But actually these types of uncertainties that we've seen today in terms of trade, from the Trump administration, trade wars with EU, with China, in terms of other geopolitical tensions, and in terms of the health shock that we've been experiencing. Hopefully we can learn some lessons from the MENA economies for the rest of the world. So commodity exporters they're very heterogeneous. There's a group of high, there are a group of middle, and there are a group of low-income countries. And they possess a huge, obviously, share of natural resources in the world. So, for instance, 90% of crude oil reserves and about 20% of world GDP and trade it comes from the commodity exporting countries. And this is I like this figure because this figure basically shows you the volatility in gross domestic product. This is what we use to measure economic activity in a country. Some people argue this is not a good measure, but this is one measure that we have we have it across a large number of countries. And you can see how GDP growth volatility in these resource-rich Middle East regions. So the green line is the Middle East countries, and it's showing you from 1980 until April of this year. And you can see how volatile really these economies' GDP growth volatility has been. And if you compare it actually to other emerging and developing countries, this is the red line, you can see how, and also advanced economies, obviously the blue line, with the exception of the great financial crisis. What you notice here is that Middle East countries is moving up and down like a yo-yo. And that's obviously not good, this level of uncertainty. So I'll give you a concrete example. So between 1980 and 2020, GDP growth volatility in the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, so this is the Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. These are the 6 quite high income countries with a high level of oil production and gas production, natural gas production. The volatility in these 6 countries, in the GCC countries, had been at least 3 times higher than other countries, which are also exporters of commodities. So Chile in terms of copper and Norway in terms of oil, and this is due to a number of reasons. And mostly, I will argue, is because of the shocks that they've been experiencing, the GCC countries and the Middle East countries have been experiencing, but also the government responses to these shocks that have been extremely, extremely poor. So, in other words, the volatile environment in not just the GCC, but the Middle East and North Africa region has basically led to an increased uncertainty in the national economy. And this has had serious implications. One thing we observe is whenever commodity prices drops and these countries go into a recession, You can see it clearly in public investments, such as infrastructure, is one of the first things to be cut. And the private investment also is impacted because of the high level of uncertainties that these economies are subject to, discouraging locals as well as foreigners from investing in the local economy, and therefore directly reducing not only the size of the private sector investment, but the size of the private sector itself, lowering potentially research and development potential of the economy, incentivizing people to seek opportunities abroad, as we've seen most recently. And obviously what the problem with this is that this lower investment, this depresses economic activity in the long run even further for these economies. So the potential of these economies is depressed even further. Every time we go into recession and this infrastructure and human capital investment is cut, future growth is going to be lower, essentially. And not to mention that this high level of uncertainty essentially will limit the opportunities for the private sector, because they will seek opportunities and entrepreneurship in particular abroad. So this is a very serious problem. So this volatility curse, mainly here through the commodity channel, but also through other channels, have been extremely problematic for these countries. I want to show you the case of Iran. This is from a publication. It's in Farsi, but I'll try to explain. The only thing you need to look at is basically the bar at the very end, at the left. So if you look here, this is the volatility in Iran, and this is massive compared to with any income groups across the world: low income, high income, middle income. And this volatility, this huge volatility in itself, has then depressed the potential of the Iranian economy. So that's one of the major problems. And just to illustrate how bad things are, so in fact, it is not the case that because these economies have oil and natural resources, gas, and other commodities, so they're abundant in these commodities, that these economies are performing bad. In fact, what we show in work with colleagues in the book, but also with my colleague Mehdi Raisi at the IMF, is that actually when commodity prices increase, this leads to an increase in the income of these economies. So it's as if they're winning the lottery. So you're winning the lottery, but it's not that you win the lottery once, you keep winning the lottery because you have access to these oil and natural gas resources for many decades. Now, the problem is that when we have these swings, so when commodity prices drop, then what happens is that these economies, heavily reliant, fiscal policy is very pro-cyclical, basically cuts in, as we mentioned, infrastructure investment, leads to a drop in economic activity. And these swings are the problem. So let me show you another graph, which is basically what's the source of this uncertainty. And what you notice in these figures is that the volatility is affected by the negative. Basically, higher the volatility is, the lower the possibilities are in terms of technological progress, TFP, that we measure in economics, or capital accumulation, in other words, investment. So the higher GDP growth volatility, the lower GDP growth is in these economies. And the higher GDP growth volatilities, there's lower levels of investment, which impacts growth in the future. And the higher GDP growth volatilities, there's limited opportunities for technological advancements in these economies. So, in other words, the main problem in these economies is that they have been subject to a volatility curse. This is not that they have access to a lot of resources, but it's the fact that they do not manage these resources in a way so as to reduce the impact of commodity cycles on their economies. Now, I've talked about one level of uncertainty, and actually what we've noticed is that we have been subject to new sources of uncertainty. So mainly I've discussed the commodity channel, but in the last few decades, not only MENA economies, the Middle East, North Africa economies, but also the rest of the world have been subject to new sources of uncertainty. And I want to talk about three major sources of uncertainty, in particular for these economies. So as you might know, the US shale oil revolution was a significant impact in creating volatility in commodity markets. And let me explain why. So production of oil historically has involved methods. So for instance, offshore extraction, And these methods require large upfront spending and involve a relatively long lead time. So you can't just turn off and on the production levels. And one of the most important things actually is once the process is up and running, reducing quantity or increasing quantity takes time. Now, what's happened over the last decade, in particular in the United States, is that the technological advancements have allowed us to access unconventional oil. And this unconventional oil is usually called shale oil or tight oil. And these technological advancement has made the extraction of shale oil or tight oil or whatever you call it, very efficient in the sense that it's like a manufacturing process. You can, when prices go up, you can up the production. It's like turning on a tap. And when prices drop and it becomes too costly, you basically can turn off the tap. And that's what we've been observing. So one of the actual important implications of the oil revolution in the United States is that, it's been US oil production can play an important role in balancing demand and supply globally. And that basically means that the low oil price environment that we've been experiencing since 2014 could be persistent. But it has actually a more important meaning is that oil prices can be even more volatile than they have been in the past. And this new volatility creates additional uncertainty for resource-rich economies, with obviously negative implications for economic activity and investment, as we just discussed. So to give you an example, we had a huge and rapid, as this figure shows, a rapid expansion of US oil between roughly 2005 and 2014. So over those 10 years, US production increased massively. And to give you some context, actually, US was a major oil importer in 2005. It's now a major oil producer, in fact. And what happened was that this excess oil in the US led to excess oil globally, which led to a drop by oil prices by over 50% in 2014. So oil prices halved in 2014. But because oil prices dropped, it became very costly to extract this shale oil. So lots of shale oil, the wells were basically, it wasn't profitable anymore. And you can see what happened here in this graph is that rig counts, which measure basically how fast things are being extracted, they plummeted in the US. Give you another example. So between 2014 and 15, OPEC countries, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, had a supply agreement. They cut the supply of OPEC countries, OPEC plus countries, Russia as well. And in that period, oil prices doubled. So oil prices doubled in 2016, and that led to, so you can see the volatility. Oil prices dropped by 50%, and then they doubled in 2016, 2 years later. But what that did was that break-even prices of shale oil were now actually lower than the actual price of the oil. So rig count started rapidly increasing, as you can see in this graph. And the last example, you can barely see it in the data, but you can see what the predictions of the Dallas Fed are, is that the COVID-19 health crisis led to obviously a substantial drop in global oil demand, and mainly due to these lockdowns that we've been experiencing. And that led to basically a sharp fall in oil prices. And oil prices were actually $20 per barrel lower than break-even prices of oil in shale. In Texas, for instance. And that basically led to a huge drop in rig counts and drop in US production. So basically what's happening here is that what we are observing is that US shale is actually bringing a huge level of uncertainty to the market and therefore to these resource-rich economies. So there's an additional source of uncertainty that we've been experiencing recently. To show you what the implications are, obviously shale oil production increasing means that oil prices are lower. That's actually good news for advanced economies like UK, US, Euro area, Japan, and oil importing countries like China. But it's a terrible news for basically resource-rich economies because there is a huge drop in prices. Therefore, the government revenues do drop, and the government revenues drop. They cut investment in infrastructure and human capital. So what we observed actually following 2014 was massive cuts in investment in, for instance, the MENA oil exporters and the GCC countries. But the oil exporters in the Middle East have very strong ties with Middle East and North Africa oil importers through remittances. So Jordanian workers in Saudi Arabia or Egyptian workers in Kuwait sending money back to their home countries, Egypt or Jordan, therefore boosting demand in those countries. But when oil prices dropped, remittance flows basically dropped, and that led to a sharp fall in economic activity in not just the oil exporters in the region, in Middle East and North Africa region, but also in oil importers. The other source of uncertainty, and you can see basically the oil prices are going everywhere, going up, sharp drops, increases, and sharp drops following COVID, basically, and now some recovery. So it's not that we are in a low oil price environment. We are actually in an environment where oil prices are extremely volatile. So policymakers should not think about low oil prices versus high oil prices or versus oil prices somewhere in the middle, but actually the fluctuations in oil prices. And our predictions is that obviously oil prices will be around $50 a barrel, but the volatility in oil prices will be large, and that's what has an impact on these economies. To talk to you about another source of uncertainty, which I like to call the Trump factor. So another source of global uncertainty, and not just for commodity markets, but also everywhere, is President Trump. And not just through policymaking, traditional policymaking, or through traditional diplomatic channels or diplomacy, but also through tweeting. So here's some U.S. tweets by the president, usually very early in the morning, and these tweets are obviously very heavily scrutinized by the markets. And in fact, when it comes to oil markets, he seems to be the swing factor. And although oil tweets, as you can see, do move the markets, usually early in the mornings, they only tend to have temporary effects on the oil markets. Nevertheless, they do create uncertainty and fluctuations in prices, which do have implications for people's livelihoods in resource-rich economies, not just in the Middle East, but also in other parts of the world. Now, what's the problem with this? Basically, Trump's policies, basically, not just in commodity, not just in oil, but mainly in all areas of policy, are contradictory. So I want to give you 3 examples. So there's a geopolitical agenda here when it comes to Iran. So sanctions on Iran, the intention is basically reducing Iran's oil exports to 0 barrels per day, and therefore removing about 2% of global oil production from the market, which puts upward pressure on the oil prices, which we saw following him withdrawing from the Iran deal, or more Iran nuclear deal. But it's not always been clear that this is what will happen. So when Trump withdrew from the deal, actually the administration then gave waivers to loads of countries. So Saudi Arabia started to increase oil to compensate for Iranian oil being taken off the market, but the president allowed India and South Korea and Japan to keep importing oil from Iran. So this exacerbated uncertainty. The problem also is not just there's also a domestic political agenda. So you want to keep gas prices in the US low for election purposes. And this was especially true in 2018 US election. But the problem here is if you keep oil prices low, therefore petrol prices and gas prices in the US low, you're also keeping shale oil from expanding. The other policy agenda is obviously that oil should be a big feature of the US economy. And what shale oil producers in Texas, for instance, need currently is between $46 and $52 a barrel. But when he imposed these sanctions on Iran, basically oil prices dropped substantially. So, and below break-even prices in Texas. So there's a contradiction in policy. And finally, obviously, we have the trade wars. And the trade wars, there are many elements to it. But when it comes to the commodity market, these trade wars create additional layers of uncertainty, putting upward pressure on commodity prices. So on one hand, the president wants low oil prices. This is the tweets he's doing. This on the other hand, he wants high oil prices because he wants the U.S. shale industry to basically flourish. And then he also wants to have these trade wars, which will put further upward pressure on commodity prices. So these contradictory policies and policy objectives creates an enormous amount of uncertainty in the markets. And then finally, the other source of uncertainty is actually you can consider Saudi Arabia having moved from stabilizing markets. It was seen as a the one oil producer which had the capacity to increase supply or reduce supply significantly to stabilize the markets, to moving to become a source of uncertainty. So historically been a stabilizer, but over the last 5 years, actually been a major disruptor. So give you an example, if we had the Arab Spring in 2011 and the multilateral sanctions on Iran between 2012 and 15, to compensate for the loss in production from Iran, which was about 1 million barrels per day, which is quite significant, Saudi Arabia increased its production. So it acted as a swing producer here. But few years later, as you can see from the graph here, Saudi had a complete U-turn in terms of policy. So rather than stabilizing, it creates additional uncertainty. So I'll give you three concrete examples. In 2015, Saudi Arabia, I mean, this wasn't explicit, but it's sort of implicit, they waged a war, price war against US shale oil. The aim was to basically destroy the shale oil companies, making most of them going bankrupt. And in doing so, basically increased production substantially, depressed oil prices further, created more uncertainty. And then, as I mentioned before, in 2016, we had the OPEC Plus agreement, which read a drop in production. It required a massive drop in production by the Saudis, but just before that deal came into effect, the Saudis actually increased production massively to basically get government revenue, to get oil revenue, before they had to cut back on their production. And most recently, what we saw following the 2018 US administration imposing sanctions on Iran, that the Saudis ramped up production rapidly, followed by a huge drop in production, consequently, when they realized that Trump has imposed waivers on many countries. So these types of uncertainty, there's additional uncertainties in the oil markets, which basically exacerbates the negative outcomes for Middle East and North Africa countries. I want to point out one thing. It's not that I've been talking a lot about oil prices, but actually it's not just oil prices that are volatile, but also production levels. So if you look at these graphs, one for Iran and one for Norway, you notice that it's not that clear on this graph. I apologize for that, but you notice that the realized oil revenue volatility is always higher, regardless of whether you're in Norway or Iran or other countries, is always higher than actual oil price volatility. And the reason for that is government's responses, like we saw in the case of Saudi Arabia, by increasing and reducing production, creates an additional layer of uncertainty. So prices are moving, but production is also moving, and that creates additional uncertainty in the market. So we shouldn't just look at oil price volatility, but the oil revenue volatility of these economies. Now, if you look at the oil revenue volatility, you notice that higher oil revenue volatility implies higher GDP growth volatility. It's on the right-hand side, but the higher GDP growth volatility reduces GDP growth. This is what we discussed in the very beginning. So oil revenue volatility or commodity price volatility has been a significant determinant of low, this is based on causality, but in our book, we actually demonstrate that this is causal. This is just a scatter plot, but we demonstrate that it's causal in the chapter 3. I think it's chapter 3 in the book. Now, I'm going to skip this because of time, but I want to also show you what's the role of institutions. So what can institutions do? What's the role of policy frameworks? And in particular, what's the role of fiscal policy? So one thing we know for sure is that policy responses. So this graph basically shows you the GDP growth volatility. So this is economic activity essentially, and it shows it shows you the institutional quality. And institutional quality here is both fiscal and monetary policy. And you notice that whenever you have higher fiscal policy volatility, this is basically volatility associated with not discretionary spending of the government, but the government just deciding to boost the economy in times when it really didn't need to boost the economy, or it basically wants to prop up there's some uprisings, so for instance, the 2011 Arab Spring, and the government basically spends more money. So higher level of institutional quality usually means that the government uses less of discretionary fiscal policy. And basically what we show, I mean, a proxy for that is sovereign wealth funds. So sovereign wealth funds, usually if you have a sovereign wealth fund, that means you have good institutions, or at least you've had some good institutions. Norway is a good example, where you establish a sovereign wealth fund to essentially mitigate the negative effects of commodity revenue volatility, oil revenue volatility in the case of Norway. And what happens is that these stabilization funds, when they are properly used, so when oil prices drop or production drops for some reason, the government can dip into the use of sovereign wealth funds to be able to compensate for the loss of income, and therefore not create the yo-yo as we saw of the economy. So in other words, sovereign wealth funds can be a tool through which you can stabilize these economies. And what we show in the work with my colleague Mehdi Raisi is that actually countries that have sovereign wealth funds have on average done better in terms of mitigating the negative effects of commodity price volatility. Often people ask me, okay, you're talking about Middle East, you're talking about North Africa. Is it really the case that is institutions that are bad, or is it because of abundance of oil that these institutions are essentially didn't develop? Is it in other words, could these countries have had good institutions if they hadn't discovered natural resources? And in our volume, what we show is that although oil revenue and commodity revenue have lowered the incentives for these economies to develop better institutions. So, in the case of, for instance, Saudi Arabia or Kuwait or Iran or Qatar or Egypt, etc., Algeria, it's not been the case that these countries had good institutions even before the discovery of oil. And one clear example are these 6 GCC countries that we discussed, which have been subject to huge volatility over the last 4 decades. They had never had an incentive, even before the discovery of oil, to develop the sort of institutions because of their small population and because of the main revenue of the government being through import duties or fees on religious pilgrims, as in the case of Saudi Arabia. So there was no incentive really to develop these institutions before oil. Oil hasn't helped, but oil isn't the cause of poor institutional developments in these economies. So we have a chapter discussing this issue, that it's actually not the institutions were bad. Following the discovery of oil, institutions became bad. Institutions were actually not so great before the discovery of oil either. The other thing is, one policy implications from this is obviously that oil itself, or commodities itself, actually enhance economic activity of these countries. It's what you do with that resource that really matters. So you need to keep the volatility of commodities away from your economy. And one way to do that, is the government's response. And one way to do that is to establish sovereign wealth funds, which helps smooth the expenditure of the government. So you don't have these huge drops of infrastructure spending and huge drops in expenditure on human capital, and there consequently huge drops in private sector investments. But the government is basically able to cushion the fall in government revenue when oil prices or commodity prices are low. In fact, one of my colleagues, Shanta Devarjan, who used to be at the World Bank, has a chapter which shows that the problem is that money is being accrued to the governments. One way we could solve the problem in the region, which might not be feasible at the moment, is actually the government would just hand out the oil money or commodity money and then tax the people, and thereby creating accountability of the government by the people. So one problem of the resource is that it doesn't create accountability. In other words, the government can spend money on infrastructure projects which actually don't lead to any economic development. But if the government was taxing, which often is, we have seen introduction of some taxes in the GCC countries, but before that, with no VAT tax, very low taxes on, it was mainly subsidies in most sectors like utilities and petrol, etc., and good public sector jobs. What this idea is essentially is that pay out the money and then tax it back. In fact, it might work out to the government by taxing it back actually the government revenue might increase. But whether that's feasible is not clear, and we probably need a new social contract in the region to be able to do that. One key thing, I'm going to stop because I've talked for a very long time, but one key thing for us, and I think the conclusions from this volume, is that we need better fiscal policy. We need better, on the spending side, these subsidies that I've talked about, they're really wasteful. And these subsidies actually, exacerbate lots of problems in these economies, such as climate change, air pollution, and distorts, signals in the economy in the sense for the private sector. So really, we need to better target subsidies, and even better is to remove subsidies gradually and over time. Obviously, one important aspect of it is tax administration. There is weak institutions in terms of tax administration in the region. There is some improvement in terms of VAT, for instance, in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but actually there's a long way to go. And one important thing is obviously diversification. We know that oil is going to, 30 years ago, we were talking about peak supply of oil. Now we're talking about peak demand for oil. And with the climate change agenda globally, what will happen is that this oil is not going to provide the revenue for the governments forever. So the diversification is really key. And here I'm not talking about diversifying into petroleum products, which is what, for instance, Saudi Arabia and many of the oil-rich Arab countries have done, but actually going into other sectors and incentivizing private sectors and foreign investments. And this might seem like buzzwords, but really it's key. We need to have a better business environment in these economies. Okay, I think I'll stop there just to mention one thing. So volatility is a major problem. It's been a major problem in these economies for a long time. It's clear that we need better institutions. We need better government responses, such as fiscal policy. We need better responses in terms of monetary policy. And the new oil order that we've seen with the introduction of the Trump factor, shale oil, and the Saudi responses actually has serious implications for the Middle East and North Africa region, depressing economic activity for a very long time. After which oil is basically not going to be part of this global economy. In which case, these countries, unless they diversify, actually will not have access to this level of government revenue and investment that they've been experiencing over the last 4 decades. I think I stopped there. Otherwise, I could talk for the whole hour, but I would like to actually engage and hear your questions. So, thank you very much for listening. And I'll stop sharing the screen. Let me go to. Okay, so I've got, thanks so much for your questions. One question here is on the lessons from these oil exporters for other economies. Now, I think, so I spent the talk mainly discussing resource-rich economies, but one clear lesson we have from the experience of these economies over the last 4 decades is that if you do not manage this uncertainty, whether that uncertainty comes from commodity prices, whether that uncertainty comes from trade wars, whether that uncertainty comes from bad governance, whether that uncertainty is external, such as Trump's policies, whether it's a health crisis, if you do not manage these policies and if you do not have good institutions which help manage these policies, they are going to lead to disappointing economic outcomes. It doesn't matter whether you are an emerging market economy, whether you are a developing country, or whether you're an advanced country like the UK, US, Japan, and the Eurozone. So basically, I think one key lesson here is that we really need to beef up the institutions and beef up our policy responses. Okay, so how will the oil-rich countries economically deal with moving away from oil to renewable energy due to the climate crisis this century? This is an excellent question, right? I mean, the whole problem with these countries have been that they have been experiencing huge levels of uncertainty because of oil. And now what we're saying is that this oil, potentially is not in the medium term, is no longer going to be a key input into production globally. And what does that mean? That means basically the main source of income for these economies. So Saudi Arabia's oil export revenue to GDP is about 50%. So 50% of the Saudi income is from its oil exports. What will happen to these economies? Well, the thing is, if these economies don't act now to diversify, they will not be able to honor, the social contract to provide good education, to provide access to health, to provide cushy public sector jobs. I'm not saying these cushy public sector jobs are desirable, but if you don't provide this, you potentially have another Arab uprising soon. So I think there is a lot at play here, and there are these policy initiatives. In particular, you hear from these plans about diversifying the economy, but of what I've seen, very limited things have actually happened in these countries. The funny part is that also these countries have access to cheap energy in terms of solar, for instance, and could potentially stop using oil, as domestically even. So it's not just for export purposes, but actually supplying the local population with energy. Why are they using oil? And that that's, I think, a question that policymakers have been trying to answer in these countries every time oil prices drop. But I believe that oil policymakers think that oil prices will actually recover. So they think this low oil price environment is temporary. In 3-4 years' time, and why do they think that? Because major oil companies are not investing in conventional oil, and therefore it might be the case that in the medium term, actually demand for oil will strip the supply, which case oil prices start going up. And I think that's, I wouldn't bet on it. I think oil prices will go up, but they won't go up to the $100, $120 that we observed just before the financial crisis. So policymakers need to wake up in this region that oil is not going to be a main feature of these economies in the long term, and therefore need to act today. Are policies dependent on the non-democratic nature of the regime? So that's a very good question. So basically, I'll try to illustrate that I don't think that the institution. So this goes back to, are institutions bad because they're not democracies? I don't think that's necessarily the case. As examples, for instance, Kuwait is I think it's quite a good example. Kuwait Sovereign Wealth Fund was established in, I think, 1953. It's the first sovereign wealth fund. And policymakers then had an idea that this wealth, oil wealth, has to supply for future generations. So they created what was called the Future Generation Fund. And the Future Generation Fund receives 10% of the oil revenue each year from the Ministry of Finance. So this gets topped up, and the government cannot touch the Future Generation Fund. So this design of these types of policies, I don't think they're just contingent on a democratic process, but good governance is key. And we often observe that good governance comes hand in hand with a democratically elected government. But I think that's not I don't think that's a prerequisite. So I've got a question from an ex-Cambridge econ student. Fantastic. Thanks, Pat, for your question. What are your economics policy prescriptions to those of oil-rich MENA countries, given the three uncertain factors that are almost exogenous? So, the things that we talked about. Is there enough time, resources, financial and human capital, and political will to reform before it's too late? This is an excellent question. So in other words, we know that there's huge level of uncertainty. We know that the government has to respond to this. The question is, how is this going to be done? I think we need a new social contract. I think the governments in these regions cannot guarantee nice public sector jobs with good pensions, early retirements, and at wages which are well above private sector salaries. That cannot be a long-term solution. And even though the governments actually are spending huge amounts of human capital in the region, the attainment is not great. So we need both reform in the sense that we need to incentivize people to go into the private sector, which requires the government to, stop propping up the public sector, which is, hiring people in various ministries is very kind. But the whole reason you're doing that is because, you're saying, I received the oil money, and in exchange for this oil money, I'll give you nice jobs, for instance. That's part of the social contract. That cannot be the long-term. That cannot be a long-term solution for these economies. And the private sector development of the private sector, and I'm talking about serious private sector, not just in name. Serious private sector in these economies is key. Dubai and the UAE is a good example. So Dubai is a good example in terms of financial center, financial hub in the region. And you can think about tourism, like and also not just tourism in Dubai, but creating a hub for transportation. So Emirates and Qatar is also another good example. So these incentives are there. Whether the other economies will follow or whether it's just crowded in that space, that really needs to be looked into. But I think political reform or change in a social contract is going to be necessary moving forward. Whatever the shape that takes, I don't know. And I hope that it's not too late for that. Could you comment on how this applies to Canada, which is also resource rich? So Canada is a good example of a country which is high, it produces oil, it exports oil actually to the same extent as Kuwait. Obviously, it's a much bigger country in terms of population than Kuwait, but yeah, it's a major oil producer. The implications in terms of uncertainty is very, very small. The reason is that as opposed to Norway, where oil revenue is a big chunk of economic activity, in Canada, oil export revenue as part of the GDP is very small. So these kind of fluctuations do not really show up in the economic activity in Canada in the way we see it in the region. But they do show up in the sense of sectors. So we have seen episodes where oil prices drop, and this has a very important in certain provinces in Canada where basically it's not feasible, economically feasible, to extract this oil anymore because extraction of the oil is 5 times more expensive than oil prices. We saw that in April this year. So what that leads to is local employment will drop, and obviously local production and province revenue is going to drop. But as Canada as a whole, the impact is not that big. But there is an environmental aspect here, right? So extracting this oil in Canada, which is extremely dirty oil, is probably not going to be a part of our future. And I'm hoping in other words, the more efficient extraction of oil in terms of environment is actually the oil from the Middle East, which is really on ground, is relatively, clean in the sense that it's conventional, not unconventional oil like tight oil that we see or sand oil that we see in Canada and in the US. So hopefully from an environmental point of view, there will be a shift there. But in terms of uncertainty, the impact on Canada is very, very limited, except for certain provinces. Okay, so I love this technical question. Could you touch on how you established the causal link between volatility in commodity prices and economic growth? I could, but it would be extremely boring. I think not for me. I would love to talk about it, but if you don't mind, send me an email and I can pick it up from there, or I can refer you to text. But essentially, what we did was we plotted it on a scatter plot just to show you the relationship. This was not causal, as I hope I said in the presentation. But what we do is that we then use an econometrics approach, which takes into account various issues like endogeneity, omitted variable, causality, and show that there is a negative effect of commodity price volatility on economic activity. So in short, our econometric techniques ensure us that there is this, we can have this causal interpretation. Okay, so this is a very important question. You said goes like, you have said they never made good institutions even before they discovered oil. That's completely true for the GCC. As I said, mainly because they had revenues from except for Saudi, most of the GCC economies were basically merchant-based economies. So import duties were a big part of these economies. Saudi, the big part was actually the pilgrimage fees on religious tourism. And the question here is, so how would this change of investing or making good institutions come about? I think that is good institutions or good governance actually it will have to come about because of the extreme volatility that we've been observing in the last 5 years and because of the low oil price environment. So to give you an example, in the 80s, in the 78, 79, we had the Iran revolution and the Iran-Iraq war. Oil prices quadrupled. And then slowly oil prices start dropping during the 80s and remained low, and then they increased again. And you see, I think policymakers are betting on that oil prices are going to follow this cycle. Every 5 to 7 years, there is going to be a huge drop, but don't worry about it. We're going to go back to the peaks of 2007-8. I don't think that will come about. One was because of the climate agenda, and the second issue because of the shale oil. Shale oil is the new thing here, right? If that does not come about, that means that basically these economies, their major source of revenue, which is commodities or oil in the case of the GCC, or natural gas, will basically get eroded over time. And if that happens, I think to be able to respond to the population, there needs to be a change in the social contract. In other words, the government cannot secure good jobs, inefficient jobs potentially, and sending people, not developing healthcare domestically, but instead choosing to send people abroad to receive medical care, like in the case of Kuwait. If you want certain treatments, the Ministry of Health can authorize you to fly to, for instance, Germany or the US or the UK to perform, this surgery. That kind of things will have to stop, and domestic potential and domestic investment will have to happen. So I think institutions this will be a gradual phenomenon. It won't be this abrupt, I don't think. But there are, if you look at Saudi Arabia, for instance, there's a lot of talk about, changing the way, this Vision 2030, changing the way we think about the economy in the next 10 years. Whether that's just talk or whether that's action, I mean, as far as we've seen, there's very limited, these diversification efforts have actually led to very limited diversification in real terms. A question, when we talk about institutions, you mostly mention only about fiscal policy, but can monetary policy at all play a role in reducing uncertainty and also volatility in the region? That's an excellent question. The reason I kind of talked very little about monetary policy is because most of these economies, so going back to the GCC, except for Kuwait, which is pegged to a basket of currencies, actually most of these countries have had a peg to the US dollar for the last, I think for the last 30, no, probably the last 40 years, since the early 80s. So the peg to the exchange basically means that the monetary policy, they're importing the monetary policy from the US. It's a good reason why you have that, right? Because your main export is in dollars, oil is priced in dollars. So you want to maintain, you want to limit the fluctuation in the dollar exchange rate. But therefore fiscal policy becomes very important, because that's the only policy that you can have that can affect the economic activity in the region. But going forward, if oil is not going to be a big feature, and also because of Trump's policies, so I don't, in terms of trade, in terms of sanctions, President Trump has imposed sanctions not just on Iran, but on various people and various companies. You might have read about Huawei. These sanctions are really driven through these are really financial sanctions. The one way where the US government can punish you if you do interact with these economies is to withhold you from the international financial market. And that's problematic because everything happens through the US dollar and through the US financial system. So actually an interesting question will be, is the US dollar going to be the dominant system, or will an alternative system, maybe based on China or the Eurozone, or a collaboration China, Eurozone, and Russia develop? So, and if that happens, I think this monetary policy in these economies, obviously you won't peg to the US dollar anymore, and that will change. But that's a different topic. Sorry, I got diverted, but that's a very interesting question. Excellent. So, what are some current measures that governments are taking to combat these problems? So, I mean, one measure in terms of stabilizing revenue for the government is to increase the tax. Well, look, most of these economies are subsidy-based, so actually the government is handing out subsidies left and right. What the governments are trying to do is actually reduce those subsidies. And in many cases now introducing taxes. So VAT taxes, although very low, so at the level of 5 to 10%, is quite big in the region in terms of mentality that when you're buying goods, you're going to pay taxes on these goods. But it's very, very far from what is really needed to deal with the problem. And obviously, the problem of dealing with uncertainty has really been through the sovereign wealth fund. But the problem with that is the volatility is massive at the moment. So oil prices dropping by 50% and remaining low, Saudi dipping into its sovereign wealth fund and trying to prop up demand at the level it was before oil prices dropped, means that basically the sovereign wealth fund will be dry in the next 3 to 4 years. So obviously that's not a good strategy, because the sovereign wealth fund really is to maintain for future generations, not just stabilizing this uncertainty. So the uncertainty is huge, and therefore new policies and new measures will have to be taken. And I honestly really think one way to deal with this is to diversify the economy. So what should they diversify to? Saudi has chosen to go into petroleum products, as has Iran actually, and that's good because there's more value added there. But if the future of the globe is a future without oil, petroleum products are also going to die out, right? Eventually. So the diversification efforts have been really in the wrong direction. And one big thing that the region actually needs, the region has a lot of highly educated people, but has poor infrastructure in terms of, for instance, access to internet, speed of broadband. And if that gets propped up, actually what will happen is that I think there will be a lot more incentives for entrepreneurship. Give you an example from Iran. As a consequence of the sanctions, of the US sanctions in 2012 to 2015, what happened was US companies and companies related to the US or doing business with the US could not enter into the Iranian market. And what this did was created an enormous incentives for entrepreneurs to replicate and improve on things that are already existing in the rest of the world, because those companies could not do business in Iran. And one example is, for instance, there are apps and services like Uber, Deliveroo, with a local context that has developed. So, and that was only possible because broadband speed and bandwidth increased substantially in Iran between 2011 and 2013. Without that, none of this new technologies would have basically been successful. So government has a responsibility not just to educate people, but also provide them with the infrastructure needed to use what they've learned to develop businesses, small and medium-sized businesses, and to incentivize entrepreneurship. I really believe that there's a lot of assets in the region, but because the signals are wrong, it's better to go into work in the public sector. It's better to work for the Ministry of Finance or Ministry of Oil or Ministry of Mining or Ministry of Health than it is to go and set up your own company. And that, if clever people, talented people have to choose between a well-paid job in the public sector and a not so good, job in the private sector with a lot of effort in the private sector, then obviously they're going to choose to go into the public sector. So we have these are the main problems that need to be addressed. Good question here. Are you effectively proposing sovereign wealth funds as national hedge funds? So I think sovereign wealth funds have two elements. One of them is I don't call it a hedge fund, but I call it a stabilization fund. And another aspect of it is future generation fund. So one aspect needs to ensure that the future generations are also benefiting from this resource. If you're thinking about not yourself, but children, grandchildren, and the future generation. You want them to also benefit from this return. But at the same time, you want to also use it as a stabilization fund. The problem is the volatility in commodity prices being so huge, the sovereign wealth fund's wealth is minute. You know, if you keep maintaining this level of expenditure, the sovereign wealth funds will get depleted. Therefore, there will be nothing for the future generation fund. So no, I'm not saying that the sovereign wealth fund should only act as a stabilization or hedge, but it should help. Yes. Norway is a good example. Norway puts all of its oil money into the Norwegian pension fund, or it used to be called Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. And then the Norwegian government takes, I think, 3% of the returns on that fund to use domestically. I think a system like that, which maintains the portfolio, but allows you to access the returns of it to hedge or stabilize the economy, is probably a good design. But are these economies able to move in that direction? It's not clear with this level of expenditure. I mean, it is not possible. Okay, so I'm going to take one last question. Sorry if I don't get to answer all your questions. So the diversification, which new industry sectors do you think MENA economies could and should move into? So as I said, I don't think the way we've been, policymakers are telling the region to do it is right in terms of going to petroleum products, which is a quick way of doing things and more value added than selling the crude, but actually investing in what's going to be the future of the country, which is entrepreneurship, small and medium-sized enterprises. In other words, it's better to create a better environment for businesses than to think about what should I do with this oil, or how do I get more value added from this oil. So, and to do that, we need to have the infrastructure. So we need to have the education, and also one needs to have basically infrastructure in terms of internet access, bandwidth, and speed. I think we have 60 seconds left, and I don't want to keep you. I'm sorry if I didn't have time to answer your question. I'm obviously more than happy to answer anything you want. If I think after the webinar the questions will disappear, but if you send me an email, I'm obviously more than happy to reply and discuss with you. But thank you so much for listening to me. I really enjoyed your questions, and wish you a wonderful day wherever you are in the world. Thank you.